Welcome, please, Professor David E. Bernstein. He's a professor at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia School of Law, and he's the author of several books, including some books on the history of economic liberty. In fact, Professor Bernstein is one of the nation's leading experts on the history of the right to earn a living as protected by American courts. He's also a blogger at the Volokh Conspiracy. If you don't read the Volokh Conspiracy regularly, you should. It's a priceless source of information on the legal developments in the courts of the United States. And he's the author of this book, Classified. This is his most recent book, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America, and submitted a brief, an amicus brief in the case, the affirmative action case that we're going to be talking about, that was cited rather extensively by Justice Neil Gorsuch in his concurring opinion. Okay, so welcome to Professor Bernstein, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. And I should say that Tim is also one of the leading experts in the country on the history of the right to earn a living.
You know, it's funny, I was thinking about when we first met. I'm pretty sure we first met when I was still in law school at a softball game in Washington, D.C. between the Cato Institute and the Institute for Justice Law Clerks, if I remember right. But that was, I'm going back almost a quarter century now. Now, about the affirmative action case. Now, everybody read about it in the news. We saw it was a great victory for those of us who don't think that government-funded schools or the government in general should be picking and choosing people on the basis of their biological ancestry. And I was summing up the case by saying that I think this case is Brown versus Board of Education for Asians. Do you think that's an accurate description?
Well, one of the results of universities engaging in what amounts to racial balancing, even though they denied they were doing that, was that admissions is a zero-sum game. Harvard, UNC, other schools, they weren't saying, oh, we have to admit more Hispanic and Black and Native American students, so we'll expand the size of our class. They kept the class the same size and decided that they had to sort of have a representative sample of those particular populations. And as the population, in particular of Hispanics, has grown from something like 5% of the population in the 70s to 20% now, it obviously leaves less room for everybody else, especially less room for the growing Asian American population, which has grown from about 1% of the population in 1970 to about 7% now. But more important, based just on sort of test scores and grades and your standard achievement factors, Asian Americans constitute maybe 40% of the people who would normally be admitted into top schools, but the top schools were sort of putting an informal ceiling of somewhere around 20% on them. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, the SAT, of course, is the leading test in most of the country, is also the ACT for college admissions. It's on a scale of basically 400 to 800. And of students in the United States who receive 700 on their math SAT or over, 42% of them check the Asian American box on their application. So about 40% of the top students in the country are Asian American, but if schools took that many just based on merit, they wouldn't be able to have their school catalogs, their advertising materials look like the old United Color of Benetton ads, which is basically their goal.
Yeah, and it seems like it's been a long tradition, I think, in the education realm, that part of what schooling is supposed to be is not just introducing people to ideas and teaching them history and philosophy and stuff, but also introducing them to society in general. And so one of the arguments on the pro-race preferences side is we're trying to give people an experience of diversity so that students who come here from, the middle of nowhere or some small town where they've never met a person of a different race comes to our university campus and experiences the diversity and so forth, that equips them to go out into the workplace and meet with people that they otherwise would have had no experience dealing with. What's your thought on that as a rationale for race preferences?
Well, there's something to be said for that, objectively speaking, but it's particularly in the case of Harvard, there's an irony there, which is that Harvard was not founded, was not run for the vast majority of its history in anything resembling that way. It was basically a finishing school for the Protestant elite. At some point, a lot of Jewish students, and to a lesser extent Catholic students, were coming into Harvard, and the alumni were unhappy, and some of the students from the prep schools were unhappy. So they said, okay, we need to put a quota on Jews and Catholics and so forth. And then by the 1950s, that was like the 1920s. By 1950s, this was sort of had a bad odor. So they said, okay, we're going to now rely much more on SAT scores, much less on what school you went to. However, we still don't want too many Jews here. So we are going to say, not that we're taking in people because they're Protestants and so forth, and because we don't want too many Jews, we're going to say we want geographic diversity. We shouldn't have all Jews and Catholics from the Northeast. We should have the small town farm boy from Iowa and so forth. So the diversity rationale was really invented by Harvard to justify, even once they got rid of quotas, still not really using merit as the sole or primary predictor of whether you get admitted for a lot of students. They filed a brief in one of the early affirmative action cases in 1978, in the Bakke case, explaining their system, how they look to see whether you're an athlete, whether you're well-rounded, whether you're geography, whether you play an instrument, whether you're all sorts of different factors. It said, see, so just like we consider this, we consider race as well. It's just one of those factors that makes the school more diverse. And Justice Powell, who was the deciding vote, bought this like 100%. But in the Harvard litigation, it was pointed out that the current litigation, that actually this was complete BS, and that everyone knows, like, that's been sort of shown by historians, that this was all really about keeping down the number of Jews and Catholics. So one of the briefs filed by a coalition of organizations actually used, I think, a good word, which is Harvard was recidivist. They were discriminating against Jews and Catholics for decades, and then once that became unfashionable, they pretended they really weren't, but they still were. But then as Asians grew and grew as a larger percent, they actually went back to almost explicitly limiting Asians. And I will say, it's really kind of a shocking chart that I don't have it. I wish I had it actually put on the screen, but the Asian American population, I think everyone's aware, has been growing dramatically since around 1980 with the immigration. And in particular, the Indian American population, which used to be minuscule, is now relatively large. And Indian Americans do the best of all these groups. So you would expect from like 1990 till today, especially also more immigrants learn English and assimilate, you would expect the percentage of Asian Americans at elite schools to have gone up significantly, but basically things plateaued in 1990. So around in 1990, the top schools were all admitting about 16 to 20% Asians, and that's what they were admitting when this litigation started in 2016 as well.
Yeah, the Asian angle in all these conversations particularly strikes home to me because I'm from California originally. And California was never a slave state, but the closest thing that California had in its history to slavery was the treatment of Chinese immigrants in California during the gold rush and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And in California, discrimination and hostility toward Asians, both from China and Japan and other places, was so extreme that until the 1950s, it was illegal for an Asian person to own real property in California. You couldn't own land in California. In fact, there's a town just south of Sacramento called Lockie, California, which is one of the largest Chinatowns left in California. It's an old Chinatown. It's called Lockie because it was owned by a family that allowed the Chinese immigrants who lived there to lease the land for $1 a year in order to set up a Chinatown because they weren't allowed to own land there. So there's a long and serious history of discrimination, and very violent discrimination, by the way, race riots throughout the early 20th century in California, aimed against Chinese and Japanese and Asian immigrants generally. And here, the state of California in the 21st century continues to discriminate in subtle and clever ways against Asians seeking admission to the state universities. I think it's really shocking when you look at the history. And by the way, you mentioned the history of Harvard and UNC. There was a rather darkly amusing footnote in the majority opinion where it says, we're told we should defer to university administrators. The entities that we're supposed to defer to are the very ones that engaged in this kind of discrimination in the past.
Yeah, and I have to say, it's very interesting to me. I always think back. It really made a big impression on me when I was a teenager. I was reading an article in Newsweek. I actually found it at some point. I think it's in my notes in some file somewhere. Where they were discussing affirmative action in the 1980s, And as early as the 1980s in the West, in the East Coast, where I grew up, there weren't that many Asian Americans, so schools still were not discriminating. There just weren't enough for it to be, from their perspective, a problem. But there were a lot in California, and Berkeley and UCLA were widely believed to be discriminating. So two things that I remembered about this article really stuck to me. One of which was that people were suing individual parents who were like appalled their kid was 1600 on the SATs and so forth wasn't getting in. And what the article made clear was that Berkeley and UCLA would just privately let that, quietly let that student in rather than face the lawsuit. But also they quoted a professor at Stanford who said, well, if these schools took people just based on merit, academic merit, it would be 80%, they'd be 80% Jewish and Asian. And my response at the time, and still today, is like, well, so what? Right? Why should we group people by these sort of arbitrary classifications of birth? I mean, let's put Jews aside for now. I mean, Asian American is a particularly ridiculous way of saying, well, they're all the same somehow. I mean, this is Asia, the part of Asia that's recognized as Asian American, Eastern Asia, Philippines, and South Asia, like India, Pakistan. That's like 65% of the world's population, right? Like, what does someone from Pakistan have to do with someone from Vietnam? Have to do with someone from Indonesia and so forth? And I say, well, these are all just all the same because another Asian is just the most racist, ridiculous, stereotypical thinking, and it's sort of amazing that this is sort of accepted without question in what people think of, at least, as enlightened circles.
Oh yeah, and particularly, studying the history of of hating Asians in California, the long tradition of xenophobia toward Asians in California. It's striking that there seem to be two kinds of racism. There's the racism that says, oh, this minority group is stupid or lazy or whatever. But the hatred toward Asians in California has since the beginning of the state's history. It's been predicated on these people are smart and work hard and we can't compete against them, therefore we should exclude them. That has been the entire theory of hating Asians in California from the beginning. But on speaking of California, now in 1996, I think it was, California passed the California Civil Rights Initiative, which amended the state constitution to prohibit racial preferences or racial discrimination, and in theory outlawed race preferences in state universities. But anybody who knows anything about California knows that all that really did was it pushed it underground. It pushed discrimination by the state universities into a form of disguised discrimination. Do you think that that's likely going to be the result from the decision in the Harvard UNC case?
Well, there's certainly going to be some of that. I mean, it's already been anticipatory, some of that, in the sense that in California in particular, as you know, and listeners may or may not know, in 2020 there was a referendum to repeal that portion of the California Constitution and allow, once again, for racial preferences, and it went down. Even in liberal California, it went down to a pretty dramatic defeat. And basically immediately afterwards, the University of California schools, which had already, like many schools, gone to standardized tests or optional, said not only are they optional now, you cannot submit standardized tests. Now, why don't they want you to submit standardized tests? They certainly have some value in seeing how academically qualified you are. Well, if there's no objective measure, right, that you can compare the different groups that they divide the students into, how do you prove they're discriminating? Right. This was Harvard's big Achilles heel in this litigation, that you could show based on their own criteria, including SAT scores. And if you're Asian, you're like 1/10 as likely to get admitted with certain scores as if you were Hispanic or whatever. But if there's no data like that, it's all just completely subjective. It's very hard. So I'm sure there's going to be some moves in that direction. But I think what's really interesting, and Brown v. Board is a good example, since you raised it, is that of course Brown announced that you have to have desegregation, but it didn't happen the next day. Eventually, you had to have a Civil Rights Act, but also there was a lot of litigation. Now, in that case, the Justice Department was involved, which I don't think that will be here. But I think one big difference now between now and if opponents of preferences had won 20 years ago or 40 years ago is there's actually an infrastructure that's developed. There are the group that brought the Harvard case, Students for Fair Admissions, is well funded. They spent millions of dollars of litigation. They have millions of dollars more, I take it, to follow up. There's another organization run by a former Trump administration official that has raised tens of millions of dollars. And I think that there's going to be even more of that, because the next phase of this case, no one's really talked about it in the media, but I assume that having won the constitutional case against University of North Carolina and a civil rights case against Harvard, the attorneys for the plaintiffs are going to be asking for attorneys' fees and perhaps individualized damages as well. And it's going to be big money. And now that the court has come down pretty hard against the use of preferences, I don't think, I think normally the schools will certainly try to evade this to some degree, but they're also going to be really concerned that the taxpayers or the university could be on the hook for a lot of money, hiding what they're doing. And it's very hard to hide things in the days of email and so forth, such a paper trail all the time. You have to be very careful, and they can be personally liable at this point if they continue to use racial preferences, because it's pretty clearly established now that they can't.
Yeah, and the technique that at least from my understanding from California is that you invite students to write an essay, and in the essay, of course, then the person mentions race, and then then the school secretly gives them a leg up for that. I don't know if you saw the video, by the way, of Erwin Chemerinsky, dean of University of California, Berkeley Law School, telling people on video that, well, what we do is we just find other ways to balance the race on the the incoming class. And he says in the video, and if I'm ever called to a deposition about this, I'm going to deny I ever said this. I mean, he says it right in the video. The dean of the law
Yeah, I
school.
mean, I like Irwin, but that's the kind of thing that might ordinarily lose you your law license for saying you're going to lie at a deposition. I guess you could say he was being facetious, but I'm not so sure. But it's a very interesting situation. I mean, I think the problem, if I were general counsel of a university that had been using preferences in the past, what I would think to myself is, if we have the exact or very close to the exact same percentage of underrepresented minorities next year, after we've abolished preferences under the Supreme Court opinions we had the year before, it's going to be pretty hard to defend ourselves against the claim that we are implicitly still using race. Right? The numbers, if you're using new criteria, the numbers have to change somewhat, right?
Right. And to be fair, Justice Thomas, in his really magnificent concurring opinion, Justice Thomas does say that to some extent race is a legitimate factor to consider if an individual applicant has individually overcome racial discrimination in some way that demonstrates strength of character, then that's a perfectly legitimate consideration for evaluating that person as an individual. And so I think to some extent, it's legitimate to say, if a student writes a person, let's say, here's how I overcame discrimination or something, and that shows something strong about me, I think we would all say that that's perfectly fine. The question is the school using it as a proxy for race, which unfortunately we have seen in the past.
Right, and right now, for whatever it's worth, from what I could tell from what I've read about the Harvard case and what I know about college admissions from writing my book, while a really powerful story might influence admissions officers in exactly that way, it's not so much that it's a race essay, but it's like, oh my God, you had this experience. But when it came to the way they actually used race, they didn't care whether it actually affected your life in any meaningful way. It was just, if you check the box, you're Hispanic. Doesn't really matter if you're a farm worker from Honduras who trekked across, whose parents trekked across carrying you as a child, the Sonoran Desert where coyotes left you and you had this dramatic story, or if you're like Julio Iglesias's great grandson, you grew up in a mansion in Bel Air, you're just equally Hispanic as far as the race bonus went.
Yeah, and on that point, you wrote an essay for SCOTUS blog about a year ago now, I guess, talking about this and saying that if you want to have a system that balances out some kind of past injustices, it would make more sense to give people extra points if they show that they are themselves actually descended from slaves, or if they reside on Indian reservations, which are political categories as opposed to racial categories, as a way of trying to make up for an injustice in the past, if that's what the school is trying to do.
Well, look, so my very strong impression is that despite the existence of the diversity rationale for 45 years that was really driving affirmative action all over, and DEI and everything all over the country, is the sense that the society needs to recognize the injustices that were done to African Americans. And we can't just say we're starting from square one now after all these years. But because the court in Bakke said, oh no, you can't do that, you can only rely on diversity, diversity became the rationale. So that's one issue. So that's really what the focus is on sort of reparative justice. Now, whether that's a good way of pursuing it or not is another story. I do think there's a lot of symbolism here. People are upset about the demise of affirmative action because that means that the white people don't care about what was done. So I think leaving some room for that would calm the debate a lot. It would only about 6% of the people going to Harvard are actually descendants of American slaves. It's like more like double that number of African Americans, but all the rest of the African Americans are first or second generation immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa who tend to have higher test scores and are easier to let in, basically. But also there's a legal issue here, which is quite properly, as far as I'm concerned, anytime the government uses race. And by the way, we should point out why we're talking about the government when it's Harvard or private university. The Supreme Court has held since Bakke 45 years ago that we interpret the civil rights laws to have exactly the same scope as the 14th Amendment has against public universities. So private schools are bound by constitutional standards, by statute, essentially. So in any event, I think quite properly, as Chief Justice Roberts, I think, said oral argument, we didn't fight a civil war over athletic preferences or legacies. Like, race is something that drives societies apart. That is a zero-sum game that leads to a war of all against all. It's quite proper to have very strict rules about when the government could use race. But there is an argument, which, I think is, I'm not sure what the courts would do with it, that being a descendant of slaves, for example, of American slaves, is a political historical classification that certainly overlaps with race. But since, again, it would exclude about half the Black students that are being admitted to Harvard now on a racial basis, it's not really the same as a racial classification. And there is a case back, it's over 50 years old, and I don't know if the court would reassert it today, but there is a Supreme Court case similarly saying that Native American tribal membership, although it overlaps, obviously almost everyone who's a tribal member is racially an Indian, but there are a lot of people who are racially Indian who are not tribal members. So it's a political historical category, not a racial one. And I think there's something to be said for making that distinction. Now, again, I'm not necessarily endorsing that we should have special classifications for ADOS, so-called American descendants of slavery in university admissions. But I think if we limited the debate to that, if we had made some allowance for that, then we could debate, is this a good idea? Is this actually helping the students? Is this unfair? That would go a long way toward reaching some sort of compromise where universities wouldn't feel the need to cheat, because, again, the greatest impetus for what they're doing is to help that particular classification of people.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well, I want to talk about your book too. Now, again, to remind everybody who's watching, if you have any questions of your own, go ahead and type them into the chat box and they'll be forwarded to me, and we'll get to your questions as soon as we can. But first, I want to talk about your book, which you filed a brief in the case that Justice Gorsuch talked about, in his opinion, about how the government goes about classifying people in the first place. I mean, we all sort of, in our conversations on this topic, we take for granted that the category of white or Black or Asian or Hispanic all are just sort of these objective tests. But your book shows that, in fact, they're wildly irrational in some ways. And for example, you mentioned in our conversation earlier that the Asian category encompasses something like 60% of the entire world's population. Explain how that works.
So I won't go into the whole long history, which is all very interesting, actually. In fact, I mean, I learned also stuff. I love being a professor for this reason. Just writing my book, like, wow, that's interesting, and who would have thought that? But to give a very brief version of it, in the 1970s, the government, thanks to civil rights legislation and other legislation, was keeping data on ethnic and racial classifications in all sorts of ways, in employment, in education, in mortgage, in bank lending, and so forth. But the problem is we've never had official federal racial classifications outside of the census and outside of immigration law. There's nothing in the Constitution that divides the population by race. And what was discovered that especially for what we now call Hispanics, but more generally, it was an issue that different federal agencies were using different uh, definitions. So some federal agencies were only collecting data on Mexican Americans or Chicanos. Chicanos implies mixed race, so it's actually more limited than Mexican Americans. Some were including Puerto Ricans, some were also including Cubans, some were including all three groups plus other Spanish speakers. Some were using Spanish speaking households, some were using Spanish surname, some were using Hispanic, some were using Latino, some were using Hispano. I think I counted up like 12 or 13 different ways this population was being counted. And none of these were objectively right or wrong, depending on what your goals were, but they were inconsistent. So the government got together a federal interagency commission to say, okay, let's figure out how we're going to classify these people, and exactness or preciseness is less important than uniformity, right? Because how do we know if what we now call Hispanics are improving in education if we're not measuring them consistently in different sub-agencies? So this has had a dramatic impact in American life because, like you said, we now have come to accept these different groupings as being sort of natural and logical when they're really not. And it is the group, the universities at some point in the 70s, they all use different criteria themselves for who is eligible for affirmative action. For example, in Bakke, it was only Mexican Americans, not Hispanics, but everyone sort of coalesced eventually around these government classifications. And for something that has had so much impact on both the law and how we see ourselves and each other, it was amazingly uncontroversial at the time. You don't see like big headlines in the newspapers, debate over, racial. Everyone thought it was just like statistical bookkeeping. And when, in fact, when the Office of Management and Budget published its final rule on these different groups, it said, and how we classify them, it said, by the way, these are not meant to be anthropological or scientific, and they're not meant to determine eligibility for programs. In other words, not for affirmative action. They're just for statistics, right? Just to, and of course, immediately everyone starts using them for all the purposes that they say they aren't. So just to give you an example of how these classifications work, Hispanic is defined as anyone of Spanish origin or culture. So that means, for example, that people whose ancestors came to the United States directly from Spain, never set foot in Latin America, are Hispanic. Most people don't realize that. But Brazilians, because they're of Portuguese ancestry, not Spanish, are not, even though they're Latinos. So most people think, oh, the Hispanic category includes Brazilians, but not Spaniards, but it's actually the opposite. How we come to this, there was a panel of 3 volunteers from federal agencies, 1 Cuban American, 1 Puerto Rican American, and 1 Mexican American. They sat in a conference room for a few weeks. They argued about it, and they eventually agreed on this definition to use the word Hispanic. It was that arbitrary. So as you might imagine, there are all sorts of anomalies in these classifications. So Hispanic is based on this cultural origin of being eventually leading to Spain and so forth. But then Black or African American is defined by anyone with ancestry in one of the Black racial groups of Africa. So anyone who tells you, oh yeah, my cousin checked off African American, even though he's Egyptian or white South African, someone may actually do that. And it's not always clear from the forms what the definitions are, but officially speaking, you have to be what we call Black to, or have Black ancestry, Black African ancestry, not just African. So that's a racial classification. Asian is based on someone who is a descendant of one of the original peoples of Asia, whatever that means, but only up to the western border of Pakistan. After that, you're white. So Arabs, contrary to popular belief, are officially white, and so forth and so on. And all these lines are extremely arbitrary. Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, the draft of these rules said they're white, they're Caucasian after all. And then some Indian American group found out about it. No, we want to be Asian. We want to be eligible for affirmative action in government contracts. And by the way, I don't know when's a good time to say it. I'll just say it now. One thing about Asian Americans is that there is a split in the Asian American community, not just in ideological and political lines, but in different groups. I think Chinese Americans are much more hostile to these preferences because they're really focused on, I want to get my kid into Harvard or so forth. They're really, they're the way they experience the preferences is disproportionately in college admissions. People from South Asia, like Indian Americans, a lot of them come here, go to grad school at MIT or whatever, or at Stanford or CIT, and they open a engineering company, and now they want to do defense contracts or other government contracts, and they benefit from preferences because while in admissions in universities, Asian Americans face discrimination, in government contracting, they get the exact, oddly enough, they get the exact, you could be someone who came in from Bangalore 5 years ago, got your citizenship, apply for government contract, you immediately get the same quote unquote racial preference for that contract as someone whose ancestors were enslaved here 300 years ago and were sharecroppers living through Jim Crow and so forth.
It's amazing. And as a result, from your brief, there was a couple really telling passages. There's one here: only a minority of people assigned to the category of Asian identify as Asian or Asian American. Not less than a majority of the people that the government calls Asian consider themselves Asian when they're asked to in polls.
Yeah, I mean that's one of it's again lots of fascinating stuff. To write the classified, I had to read sociology literature and political science and history, and oddly enough, the law professors haven't written that much about this, even though it's a legal issue. But Hispanics, what we call Hispanics or Latinos, the vast majority of them don't prefer being called Hispanic or Latino either. They prefer either an ethnic national kind of classification like Mexican American or just American. But they say, yeah, if you want to call me Hispanic or Latino, that's fine. Like that's my secondary identity. And that makes sense because they have this common Spanish language and they watch Univision. If they speak Spanish, they have something in common. On the other hand, Asians have never taken much to this Asian American classification, except people who go to elite universities where you're expected to call yourself Asian American. I mean, if you think about people that you probably know who are of Asian descent, I don't know anyone who says, "Oh, where are you from?" Well, I'm Asian, right? Of course, they say
Right.
I'm Taiwanese, I'm Chinese, I'm Japanese, I'm Filipino, right? And so when it says that a minority, when I write in the book that a minority of people who are classified as Asian accept the Asian American identity, that's even as a secondary identity. In other words, it's not that, oh, I think of myself as Chinese American, but you could also call me Asian, as in a broad sense. They reject it entirely. They do not want to be called Asian American. And it, again, completely makes sense. I mean, if you're a Chinese person, like, why are you grouping me with people from India and so forth? I have to tell a related anecdote because it's really funny to me, and it reflects how the American sort of progressive establishment is oblivious to this sort of thing. During the 2020 election season, I was just finishing my draft of my final manuscript of Classified. I'm listening to NPR. The theme of the week is that they're going to Asian American community, the Asian American community, see how they're voting and taking their sort of political temperature. And every day they'd say, today we're looking at the Asian American community. And our focus today will be on the Chinese American Democratic Society of Los Angeles. And the next show would be, and here we are, the Korean Republicans of Annandale, Virginia. And even though they kept saying Asian, in practice, there weren't any Asian groups out there.
Right.
There weren't, you might expect, ethnic groups, just like, 100 years ago, you wouldn't have found a Euro-American political organization. We found German and Italian and Polish and so forth.
Right. Yeah. And you say, this is another passage of the brief that I think shows why that is one of the reasons why that's so problematic. You write, this confusion about who counts as Asian apparently extended to the University of North Carolina's admissions office in response to an admission officer's message noting that one applicant had a perfect 2400 SAT. Another admission officer asked, brown? The first admission officer responded, heck no, Asian. This exchange reveals a misunderstanding of the term Asian as excluding dark-skinned individuals with ancestry in South and Southeast Asia. So even the people trying to apply these, of course, trying to apply these arbitrary categories necessarily act arbitrarily in ways that end up discriminating by reinforcing sort of their own racial assumptions when employing these arbitrary criteria.
Yeah, there was really truly remarkable exchange during oral argument where I think it was Justice Kavanaugh asked the counsel for University of North Carolina, well, it seems he was suggesting that's kind of arbitrary the way you divide people. He said, how do you classify someone who's Arab American? And I assume where he was going with that is, well, why is someone who's Arab American? Obviously, Arabs face some different challenges and they look somewhat different than the white population in general, to say, well, why are they not a minority group, but say Spanish Americans are? And the UNC's counsel responded, I don't know what we do. And I'm still wondering, maybe someday I'll meet the guy and ask him if he could tell me off the record whether he really didn't know that his, because this would strike me as being unbelievably bad preparation for the case, because it's right on the common application the college students use. It says to check the white box, and it says, and then it asks you to check whether you're of Middle Eastern descent or European descent. So it's right there that you're white. But maybe he really didn't know. It never even occurred to him to think about it, because we just assume these classifications are somehow natural and obvious, when in fact, why is Asian stop at the western border of Pakistan? Oh, another really,
Right.
to me, amusing thing in the case is maybe inspired by my brief, maybe not. Justice Alito said, with regard to the Asian classification, why should someone from Afghanistan accept the idea when you tell them, oh, we're going to give you less of a chance to get in here because you're Asian, because we have a lot of Chinese people here? What does that have to do with him? And the reason this was kind of amusing is because, again, the Asian classification officially stops at the western border of Pakistan, making Afghans actually white. So even Justice Alito couldn't keep this straight, because really, what's the difference? You're a big clan of Pashtuns, and one half the clan lives on one side of the river and therefore is in Afghanistan, the other's in Pakistan, but then one group is white and one is Asian.
Yeah, totally. And on that point, by the way, about checking off boxes, you say you point out both in your book and in the brief that the government frequently relies just on self-reporting, just lets people say what they are and then just takes their word for it. But not always. If you try to use it, for instance, you give the example of some white firefighters who tried to claim that they were black on they had some reason for making it, although the reason they were doing it was because they want for was opportunistic, but they had some excuses, and the government did not allow them to self-identify.
Yeah, and of course, everyone, you're probably already thinking of the follow-up question. Everyone says, what if you could self-identify by sex, which is clearly has more of a
Right.
genetic basis than race? How are you not able to self-identify by race? So in fairness, though, universities on the one hand do allow you. I think I thought I would, but I did not come across a single incident that was I could find where anyone's race was ever challenged after they were admitted. Say, hey, wait a second, you don't look black, we're going to revoke your acceptance. And so in a sense, it's amazing the system has lasted so long, because anyone can really write down whatever they want, and the odds of anyone saying anything are very small. But in the context of government contracts or affirmative action in employment, there have been instances, as with a firefighter case, as with a bunch of cases I talk about in the book, where someone has challenged it. Law professors, if you read the law review literature, until my book at least, people will say that firefighter case, that's the only time in modern history anyone's ever questioned anyone's race, legally speaking. It's all self-identification. And I thought that can't possibly be true. There's enough money involved, enough reason for fraud and exaggeration, like Elizabeth Warren, for example. Everyone knows too, and there have to have been some situations where people were questioned, and there are about 24 cases I found from agencies. Of course, there are probably more that just weren't reported in easily accessible places, like in databases that I could find. But it's especially prevalent with regard to Hispanics. So what seems to happen is someone applies to be a minority business enterprise contractor, which would give them preferences in contracts. Their name is Tim Sandifer. And so it's, wait, Sandifer doesn't sound Hispanic. Give us some indication that you really are. And you'll say, I mean, not you, but Metaverse Earth B, Tim Sandifer says, well, my grandfather came here from the Canary Islands, which were then a Spanish colony, and his second language was Spanish, and I consider myself Hispanic. I have a lot of Spanish, I have a lot of Mexican neighbors. I go to their quinceañeras and so forth, and whatever stuff you say. And then the person in charge of checking off the box saying, yes, we certify. He says, no, that's not good enough for me. And there have been cases where this has then gone on to appeal. And the question is, are you Hispanic enough? Now, technically, if you, again, read the actual federal rule, it says anyone of Spanish origin or culture. So if you want to be literal about it, which I think administrative law judges really should be, even if it's absurd in some sense. If you can identify a Spanish speaking ancestor, that's enough. And there are cases that say that. But there are some judges, administrative and otherwise, say no, even though you do have some Spanish ancestry, you're not Hispanic enough, because these programs are really meant for people who face discrimination as Hispanics, not just someone who happens to have some, a grandfather. So there's one case saying grandfather's enough, but not great grandfather. There's one case back when the FCC used to use preferences for radio licensing that said, well, one of the owners of the company has a Cuban great grandfather, so we'll give him partial. Well, there are X number of points you would normally get for being Hispanic. We'll give him some of the points. So it's like, so it's a little, it's a little, I think almost everyone in the United States is disturbed when you see federal officials or state officials deciding, are you really Black enough or Hispanic enough or Indian enough or whatever it may be, or Asian enough, because it's icky and it's disturbing and invariably relies on some sort of stereotype. There's even one case where the fact that a woman, to me, legally speaking, she was Hispanic. Her maternal grandparents were from Spain. She actually spoke Spanish, and she had this Hispanic ancestry, but because it was her maternal grandparents, she didn't have a Spanish maiden name. She didn't have a Spanish surname because she married a non-Hispanic man. But okay, those things, okay. But then the judge said, and you're blonde-haired and blue-eyed.
Oh my.
So, it's like sort of reverse Nazi here. You get, because you're not in the area, because you are in the area, and you get discriminated against.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, on that point, we had a question from one of our viewers asking, what about foreign students like Afro-Caribbeans? Are foreign students excluded from these categories? Are they treated differently, or are they considered no different from, a Black student from Newark, for example?
If the foreign student is an immigrant and applying from an American high school, then that student is Black, or whatever classification they check on the box or that they fit into. And by the way, one thing I just discovered from reading through some of the pleadings, I was looking for something else, is that if you decide not to check a box, if you chose not to participate in this process in particular, I think this is problematic if you happen to be a Black student. So I want to see if I get into Harvard on my own. I don't want, and you just check nothing. You don't want to lie and check you're white, but you just check nothing. Harvard would look, if they were interested in you, they'd try to figure out what your race was. They'd look at your Facebook posts, they'd look at your last name, what high school you went to. So really, really problematic. But in any event, if you're actually living in the United States as an immigrant, you're whatever category you check is what you are. If you are literally a foreign student who's coming from a foreign country, they are tabulated separately. So one of the oddities I've found is that universities seem to try to match their percentage of minority students to the percentage of something like the applicant pool or the demographic in the country as a whole, but then they don't take into account the fact that somewhere between 10 and 20% of their students at elite schools are from foreign countries. So if a school is like 14, says they're 14%, so a school will take, of the American students, 14% will be African American, let's say, to match the 14% of the American population in a soft quota. But then if you consider that they're really 14% of 85%, they actually wind up overrepresenting the minority groups in that sense.
One of the most common questions we've been getting is basically boils down to, what does this mean for things outside of higher education, or outside of, at least out of Harvard and UNC? And there is a footnote in the majority opinion that specifically says, we're not talking about the military here. They say, we're just not going to discuss how this applies to the military. And of course, remember the Grutter case, which was almost 20 years now. That case specifically, they relied heavily on the military filing a brief saying we need race preferences for various reasons and things. So what do you think the implications are going to be first of all, as far as the military is concerned? Do you think that this is going to have ramifications for recruitment or assignment or whatever or military academies? And beyond higher education generally, what do you think the ramifications of this are going to be?
Yeah, my guess is that military, I haven't really thought deeply about whether the military should be allowed to use race in the sense other groups shouldn't, but one can see the legal argument why the military and the military academies like West Point should be exempt. Because first of all, there's a very specific enumerated power in the Constitution for the government, for the U.S. government to set up armed forces, and under even a relatively limited view of the necessary and proper clause, they get to sort of decide how we're going to organize that. And we generally don't apply constitutional standards, like you don't have a right to a jury trial if you're in the military and so forth. But and then also the court has not disclaimed the idea that there can be a compelling interest in using race occasionally. And the military brief in Grutter pointed out that in during the Vietnam War, there was actually a serious problem where Black soldiers were having conflicts with white officers, and the fact that there were very few blacks in the officer corps was really detrimental to morale and caused extra problems. You know,
There was a race riot on an aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War, in fact.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. I don't know that much about, assuming that's all true and all that, you could imagine, and that's sort of a separate situation. That's more like the situation, the other classic example where people have argued, even people who are very skeptical of using race, where it might be occasionally appropriate to use race, is if there is a prison where the prisoners
Right.
have organized themselves into racist gangs based on their racial identity, and they're skiving each other in the bathrooms based
Yeah.
on the racial, and maybe keep them separate for a few weeks to calm the tensions, right? That this is
Right.
offensive in some way, but maybe to save people's lives in the short term, maybe that's worth it. So I think that those are separate situations. What's interesting to me is that 30 years ago or so, in two decisions, the Supreme Court ruled that you're basically not allowed to use race in government contracting, except under very narrow circumstances. And yet we now have more of that than ever. And the underlying reason for that is that because the court gave government an out, they basically said, if you have a history of discriminating in contracting in your jurisdiction, and the discrimination still manifests itself today, you're allowed to have this narrow exception. So a whole industry was created to come up with generally bogus studies, sometimes legitimate, usually bogus studies, showing that that this was true of all the groups, not just African Americans, any group. And it's a little dubious, like there weren't even people from India in most of the United States from like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. There's very few Indian Americans till like the 1980s and 90s. So how could it be that they could, they suffered historical discrimination? But basically what kept happening was people would sue, they'd win, and the government would just turn around and do a new study and create a new program. People just eventually gave up. But that said, I think that that's what's sort of happening in university admissions as well, that the government, the court would say, okay, well, we don't really like that you're using race, but you can use it for this narrow diversity purposes. And then Harvard and everybody else said, oh, what you really mean is that we could do whatever is that you're giving us a wink and a nod. And so long as we don't explicitly say that we're using quotas, we could do whatever we want. So now that's gone in this context. It's clearly not the rule. No more winks and nods in admissions. I suspect we will no longer have winks and nods in government contracting as well. And government contracting is really much less of a rationale, even than in universities, than what you could come up with. There's no diversity rationale. People aren't learning from each other,
Right.
when they're bidding for contracts. The historic, as I already mentioned, in contracting, unlike in universities, every minority group gets the same preference. So again, at least in universities, it makes some sense that African Americans, given the history, we're getting more of a preference than Hispanics. We're getting and Asian Americans, who are mostly relatively recent immigrants, are not getting a preference. But again, in contracting, everyone gets the same preference. I sort of was curious when I was writing my book, what percentage of preferences in government contracting actually go to African Americans, for whom these programs are really invented in the 1970s after the riots in various cities. They had the famous Kerner Commission. What do? We have to bring Black people into the economic and social mainstream. One way we do that is by encouraging Black businesses. And I tried through some friends in the Trump administration to get data on how we break down who's getting these preferences. And they said, no one's ever going to release that. It'd be too embarrassing. Well, I just found out last night, so you're going to be the first ones to hear this publicly, really. I mean, it was in the Wall Street Journal, so you won't be the first ones, but the first ones to hear me talk about it. Anyway, but it didn't attract much attention for some reason. They actually, inspired by a conversation I had with one of the reporters, like, hey, by the way, did you notice that article we wrote, which I hadn't? They actually FOIA'd the Department of Transportation and asked, what percentage of government minority business enterprise contracts go to African Americans or disadvantaged business enterprise contracts? And the answer for the Department of Transportation was, if you include white women who get also a preference, or women in general get a preference, if you include women, only about 11% of the contracts that go to disadvantaged business enterprises go to African American owned businesses. If you exclude women and just look at the ones that are going to racial minorities or ethnic minorities with preferences, it's about 17-18%. And of that 17-18%, we all know what percent of that is actually going to these recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. I always like to point out, by the way, not only are the recent immigrants from Africa not descendants of American slaves, some of them are descendants of slavers. Right. So it's like kind of an irony, right? Someone had to be catching and selling the slaves to the Westerners, right? So they stayed there. So some of them were actually slavers, like Obama. I think Obama's family, elite in Kenya. What are the odds that some of them weren't involved in slavery? So it's sort of this irony. But anyway, I think as this, when there's new litigation, given the stricter standards we now have in universities, given the less plausible rationales in general in contracting, and most important to me, given that I've talked about this a lot, and I always say, I don't think there's anybody who I've ever heard give a justification as to why an immigrant, say from Manila, who's from a wealthy family, has some capital, establishes a consulting company or an engineering company, why that person should get a preference in contracting, and say some kid who grew up in Appalachia with an alcoholic single mother doesn't. No one, even the most ardent proponents of affirmative action, I've never heard anyone justify it. And I think
Yeah, a point that Justice Thomas really emphasizes in his concurring opinion when he talks about the lack of any ideological diversity. That just there's this stereotype that race is all that matters, and as a result, like you said, these cultural experiences of a poor kid from Appalachia don't count for anything.
Well, since you mentioned that, I can't resist bringing up Justice Sotomayor wrote a dissent, and the dissent, I can't honestly tell you whether it's just intellectually confused or dishonest, but the way she plays around with the concept of race is that she only counts race when it's who's in what race, who's a racial minority when it's convenient, but for the most part, she refers to underrepresented minorities. And she says, oh, well, the reason we need affirmative action is because these underrepresented minorities aren't doing well. And by saying underrepresented minorities, she excludes Asians. But of course, this is completely circular reasoning, because
Right.
if you start off by saying that these are underrepresented minorities, well, why are they underrepresented? Because they're not doing well socioeconomically. So the very definition of underrepresented minority is going to tell you that they're not doing well. If you use that as a rationale for affirmative action, doesn't make any sense. What you should start with is by saying we have three major American Indians are a small part of the population. So three major groups that have been classified as minorities in the United States: Hispanics, Asians, and African Americans. Two of those groups do on average worse than average, African Americans and Hispanics. Asians are doing better than average, but then it gets even more complicated, because if you look at subgroups within each group, some Asian American groups like Indian Americans, Chinese Americans have well above average socioeconomic indicators as a group. But then Cambodians, Laotians, Indonesians, Hmong are below average or close to the average. And with regard to Hispanics, for example, 33% of the top 10 Latino groups in the US by population, Salvadorans, 7% have college degrees, Colombians, 32%, about national average have. African Americans, even them have become increasingly diverse, such that Nigerian Americans have well above average income and educational status. So so you can't just say, oh, let's by fiat define these groups as underrepresented, and therefore they're the only minorities that exist.
Yeah. On this question, you mentioned some European groups in there. One of the questions that we received was, how does Europe deal with this? Do other countries have similar kinds of programs? And if so, do you know whether they differ or are similar to ours?
I just found out, I don't know the details, that Sweden was trying to emulate the US, and their Supreme Court, interestingly, since progressives tend to worship Sweden, held that this is absolutely incompatible with human rights to divide people by race in any way. So they can't do it. France famously doesn't even keep statistics based on race or ethnicity, so it actually hinders them to some degree, because they don't really know how their North African population, they know they're not doing as well as the more established French population, but they don't really know why. I'm not against collecting data. I just think it should be done, in a more reasonable and nuanced way, and the data should match what you're looking for. The closest country that I know of, and by the way, and I have to say that I wanted to do a chapter on this, but I said, I like to keep my books short and readable, 200 pages,
Yeah,
and
that's pretty good.
and I
That's pretty
and
good.
I and that could be a whole nother book. I just didn't do it, but I did come across the fact that Brazil has really gone all in on affirmative action in government employment and
Mm.
education, but they have a problem that historically they had like 118 different ways or something of describing the mix of black, white, and indigenous that you are. So and they're a lot, in the same family, you could have someone who by looks would be white, but someone else looks black. What they actually did, which is I think most Americans I find extremely offensive. Everyone I've ever discussed this with finds it offensive. They actually have given guidance to local governments and local universities saying, okay, when someone presents themselves to you as a minority, here's how you tell. Here's how curly their hair needs to be. Here's how thick their nose, here's how wide the nose needs to be. Here's how thick their lips should be, right? And
Wow.
that's one way of stopping fraud. And in some sense, right, it makes a certain amount of sense that if you're trying to help people who are victims of discrimination, people who look like they're a member of a minority group, whatever their actual background, are going to face it. But you just can't imagine. Like I can't imagine. I can't imagine how they get away. How in Brazil
Yeah.
this isn't thought to be offensive. But that would be the alternative to mostly relying on self-identification. We're obviously never going to do that.
Yeah, you mentioned self-identification, and you mentioned earlier you put up a blog post about this a couple days ago about how Harvard will just assign people if you don't check the box at all. I have always assumed that. I always, whenever I have to fill out one of these things, I just leave the question blank because I find it offensive to be asked the question. But I've always known in the back of my head that whenever they get a form that has a blank, they just put it in the white pile. So here we have evidence that Harvard does this, and it goes even further. It looks into things like people's names and checks out their pictures on Facebook and stuff like that. It sounds rather similar to what you're just describing about Brazil.
There are some laws or at least regulations that require people to guess your race if they don't know it. When you fill out a mortgage application, if you don't check it, in the old days they would meet you in person. I don't know how they
Mm-hmm.
guess now when you're doing it online, but they're required to. Harvard isn't required to; it just does. But I'm afraid you're a little bit wrong, at least with regard to universities, Tim. My understanding is that counselors, people who consult for a living to help people get into places like Harvard, tell applicants that if you don't put down your race and your name isn't obviously like, Chinese sounding or whatever, or Indian sounding, Asian Indian sounding, they're going to put you somewhere in between white and Asian. Now Harvard apparently doesn't let it stand that way. But I think I'm guessing that Harvard isn't all that inclined to really delve into your background if you're white or Asian, if they think you're white or Asian. But if they see someone whose name is like Darnell Washington, who's from a zip code that is mostly African American, who doesn't check a box, and they want to make sure they get their target, the quota, basically the soft quota they don't have, according to them,
Right.
they will track it down, and if they can figure out you're black, they want to take credit for it.
One last question, because we're out of time, and that is more of an observation than a question, I guess. And that is, I thought that the part of your book, which again I recommend that everybody get, classified: the untold story of racial classification in America. The part of your book that really shocked me, and rightly so, is you write about how one of the horrible things about these racial classification schemes is that it encourages whites to think of themselves as a block with racial interests antagonistic to those of other racial groups. And that you talk about foreign experiences, that in foreign countries, we have seen that racial resentments over preferences sometimes boil over into horrible retaliation or retribution on the part of the majority group against the minority that it sees as having, taken advantage in some sense. And you end on a rather pessimistic note in your book, I thought. Are you still pessimistic about the future of that sort of thing in America?
Well, I think I'm a little more optimistic now, after the recent Supreme Court case. I think my book ends at sort of an impasse that the establishment, the legal establishment, the business establishment, the educational establishment, the media establishment, all the establishment institutions, legal, they're all dedicated to diversity in this very narrow sense that we've been talking about, that we need to have enough, whatever that means, of the different groups. And if Asians wind up on the wrong side, that too bad, or so forth. But they just accept it wholeheartedly. They don't even think about it. Like Justice Sotomayor, like I said, that's why I can't tell whether she just isn't thinking about it clearly or she isn't being dishonest. They just accept that, well, underrepresented minorities, we don't want that, as if that's a real thing, it's just a tautology, that some, in any multi-ethnic country, someone's going to be underrepresented. But in any event, on the other hand, at the grassroots level, not only have we made tremendous progress since let's say the 1950s, 1958, shocking statistics, 4%, not 14, not 40, 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Now it's like 95%. And if you're under 30, it's almost unanimous. And it's not just people are telling the surveys what you want to hear. Anyone who walks down in any city or town in the United States will see every possible combination of ethnicities and races coupling together, and Americans have become less prejudiced and more, but at some point there's these things clash, right? And at some point, the more the government emphasizes race and makes it a zero-sum game, the more politics organizes around race, the more likely you are to have racial resentment and to have a backlash and to reverse things. And that was my instinct, right? I thought that was obvious, and human history and psychology would tell you that. But I did then go look to see if there's any literature on this, and it turns out there is political science and social psychology literature that tells us very clearly that the more people think of themselves as being a white person in America, as opposed to whatever other identities they may have, the more likely they are to be racist. You have people on the progressive side. This is the second. We don't have time for me to tell you the most shocking thing about in the book. This is the second most shocking thing in the book, that I came across this phrase as I was doing my research, which was white. Now I'm blanking on the phrase. It's like white. Racial, I can't think of the phrase now, but some phrase that sounds really racist for white people. And I said, what is this phrase about? And I Googled it, and I thought I was going to find, David Duke and Nick Fuentes. And instead I found all these left-wing sociologists basically arguing that we need to encourage white racial identity so that whites will become woke, will wake up to the privileges that they have in American society. And once they recognize those privileges, they will then become soldiers in the battle against racism, anti-racist activists. Now, certainly there are people like that, and many of them are professors. That's how they are white, and this is how, I'm privileged, I should fight for marriage. But let's face it, even if that was a good, even if we like that story, human history, human psychology tells us that if you divide people into different groups, that the general reaction of people in those groups is not to say, oh, I'm in group A, but what I really want to do is help people in group B.
Right.
So it's very dangerous. Yeah. And I'm afraid that my progressive friends, as well, even the ones who I think are really well-meaning, they just are, you tell them, oh, what about, do you at least recognize this danger? And the answer is that would never happen. They're in some sense Whigs, they have a Whiggish view of this and just assume that there'll always be progress. Now, they all, we're not going to get a discussion of whether Trump is how racist or not is the Trump movement. They certainly think he is. And you would think that the fact that they believe that Trump has played on exactly the kind of tensions that we're just discussing would have led to say, oh, maybe this is a little bit dangerous. Maybe white nationalism is recovering partly because of these, but no, it's completely oblivious to it, I'm afraid.
That's insane. Well, thank you so much, Professor Bernstein. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you about this. And thank you, everybody, for joining us to talk about the Supreme Court's decision in the affirmative action case a couple of weeks ago, and about Professor Bernstein's book, Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. I hope that you will all join us at our next Goldwater Institute forum and at the next Goldwater Institute function that we hold in your neck of the woods. Professor Bernstein, thanks again.
Thank you, Tim.